The ticking clock sounded like a judge's gavel. The boardroom was a sterile, windowless vault high above Manhattan. The air inside was climate-controlled to a perfect, freezing 68 degrees. It smelled of expensive leather, floor wax, and the faint, metallic tang of ozone. Across the massive mahogany table sat my husband, Vance. He wore a tailored gray suit that probably cost more than most people earned in a decade. Next to him sat his lead attorney, a man with eyes like dead stones. And slightly behind Vance, draped in a leather chair like she already owned the building, was Sloane. The lawyer slid a thick stack of papers across the polished wood. The sound was like a blade scraping against bone. He did not look at me. He looked at the space just above my forehead. He explained the terms with the flat, emotionless cadence of a machine. The offer was simple. It was brutal. It was a masterpiece of corporate cruelty. Vance was a real estate scion. He treated life like a balance sheet. Human beings were either assets or liabilities. And right now, he was restructuring his portfolio. The lawyer tapped a gold pen against the contract. He said, "Evelyn, my client is prepared to be incredibly generous. He is offering you a clean break. A lump sum settlement of $20 million. $20 million. The words hung in the freezing air. It was enough money to disappear. Enough money to live in absolute luxury for the rest of my life. It was a golden parachute, woven from pure greed. But there was a condition. There is always a condition in Vance's world." The lawyer cleared his throat. He said, "The settlement is contingent upon full, uncontested custody of the child remaining with Mr. Sterling. You will surrender all parental rights. You will walk away. You will not contact him. If you agree, the funds will be wired to an offshore account by tomorrow morning. If you refuse, my client will ensure you leave this marriage with absolute zero." I stopped breathing. The room began to spin, a slow, nauseating tilt. I looked at Vance. He was staring at his phone, completely detached. He was bored. He was buying a human life, and he was bored. I looked at Sloane. She was smirking. It was a tiny, hollow, venomous smile. She did not want my son. She viewed him as a pest. A remnant of a past she wanted erased. She just wanted the victory of breaking me. Sitting next to me, his legs too short to reach the floor, was Julian. He was 8 years old. He was wearing his little navy blazer, his hands folded perfectly in his lap. He was so quiet. He was always so quiet. Julian had heard everything. He had heard his father call him a liability. He had heard the price tag placed on his head. I turned to my son. My heart was tearing itself apart in my chest. I leaned down, my voice barely a whisper. I asked him, "Julian, what do you want?" He did not look at his father. He did not look at the lawyer. He looked directly into my eyes. His gaze was ancient. It was the gaze of a child who had seen the absolute worst of the adult world and understood it perfectly. Julian said, "I do not want Dad anymore." The words were soft, but they shattered the silence of the boardroom. They were final. I did not hesitate. I did not cry. I did not scream. I reached across the mahogany table and picked up the gold pen. I flipped to the final page of the contract. I crossed out the settlement clause with a single, violent slash of ink. Then, I signed my name at the bottom, accepting nothing. Absolute zero. I stood up. I took Julian by the hand. His fingers were cold, but his grip was incredibly strong. I looked at Vance one last time. I said, "Keep your money. It is the only thing you have left." We walked out of the boardroom. We did not look back. The elevator ride down to the lobby took exactly 42 seconds. It felt like falling through a void. The doors opened, and we stepped out into the chaotic, echoing marble lobby of the Sterling building. We pushed through the revolving glass doors and hit the street. The New York wind was brutal. It was a biting, freezing gale that cut right through my thin designer coat. It was the physical shock of reality. We had nothing. No money. No home. No protection. I hailed a yellow cab. I pushed Julian inside and gave the driver the address for John F. Kennedy International Airport. As the cab lurched forward into the Manhattan traffic, I pulled out my phone. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely unlock the screen. I dialed the only number I had left in the world. Chloe. She was my old college roommate. A pragmatic, fiercely loyal woman who lived on the other side of the country. The phone rang 3 times. When she answered, her voice was thick with sleep. It was 3 in the morning in Seattle. I said, "Chloe, it is Evelyn. I left him. I have nothing. I need help." There was a heavy silence on the line. Then, Chloe said, "Get on a plane. I will be waiting at the airport." I hung up. I pulled the back off my phone. I took out the tiny plastic SIM card. I rolled down the window of the cab and threw it out into the freezing rain. It vanished into the dark, wet streets of the city. The bridge was burned. There was no going back. The flight to Seattle was a blur of exhaustion and terror. We sat in the very last row of economy. Julian slept with his head on my shoulder. I stayed awake for all 6 hours, staring at the back of the seat in front of me. I was calculating. I used to be a brilliant accounting student. Before Vance. Before I gave up my career to be a trophy wife in a Hamptons mansion. Now, my brain was running the numbers of our survival. The math was terrifying. We landed in Seattle under a blanket of heavy, gray clouds. The Pacific Northwest was perpetually damp. The air smelled of wet pine and exhaust fumes. It was a gritty, rain-soaked reality, completely alien to the sterile climate control of the Upper East Side. Chloe was waiting at the baggage claim. She did not ask questions. She just hugged me, picked up Julian's small backpack, and led us to her rusted sedan. We drove out of the city, heading south toward Renton. The gleaming tech towers of Seattle faded away, replaced by strip malls, auto repair shops, and decaying apartment complexes. Chloe pulled into the driveway of a crumbling, two-story house. She turned off the engine. She looked at me with deep sympathy. She said, "It is not much, Evelyn. But it is safe. He will never look for you here." She led us around the back of the house, down a narrow flight of concrete stairs, and unlocked a heavy wooden door. We stepped into our new home. It was a basement apartment. A low-ceilinged, damp concrete box. The air was thick with the smell of mold and old dust. There was a single, tiny window near the ceiling, covered in iron bars. In the corner, a rusted pipe dripped water into a plastic bucket. Drip, drip, drip. It was a constant metronome of our poverty. There was a deflated air mattress on the floor. A small, stained kitchenette. A bathroom with a flickering fluorescent light. I stood in the center of the room. The contrast was suffocating. 24 hours ago, I was standing in a $20 million boardroom. Now, I was standing in a freezing, moldy basement. I looked at Julian. I expected him to cry. I expected him to ask for his room in the Hamptons. His toys. His warm bed. Instead, he walked over to the air mattress, sat down, and unzipped his backpack. He pulled out a thick library book. He opened it and began to read. He did not complain. He just adapted. That night, I lay awake on the cold floor, listening to the dripping pipe. I pulled the thin blanket over Julian's sleeping body. I made a silent vow in the dark. I would not let this basement be our grave. I would forge a new empire, right here in the damp concrete. The next morning, the brutal reality of survival began. I needed money immediately. I could not apply for corporate accounting jobs. I had a 10-year gap on my resume. And Vance had the power to blackball me across the entire financial sector. I needed cash. And I needed to stay invisible. Chloe helped me find a job at a massive, chaotic diner on the outskirts of the city. They did not ask for references. They just pointed to the back of the kitchen. I became a dishwasher. The transition was a physical trauma. My days of manicures and silk dresses were gone. Now, I wore a heavy rubber apron and non-slip shoes. I stood for 10 hours a day in a cloud of suffocating steam. The dish pit was a sensory nightmare. The noise was deafening. The clatter of heavy ceramic plates, the roar of the industrial sprayer, the shouting of the line cooks. The heat was unbearable. I plunged my hands into sinks full of boiling water and harsh, industrial degreaser. I scrubbed baked-on grease from heavy iron skillets until my shoulders screamed in agony. Within the first week, my hands began to crack. The cheap soap ate away at my skin. My knuckles bled, leaving faint pink swirls in the dirty dishwater. Every time I plunged my hands back into the scalding sink, the pain was blinding. But I did not stop. I scrubbed. I rinsed. I stacked. I survived. Every plate I washed was a fraction of a cent toward our rent. Every burnt pan I scraped clean was a piece of food for Julian. I channeled all my grief, all my rage, and all my humiliation into the physical labor. I would finish my 10-hour shift, my clothes soaked in sweat and dirty water, my back aching with a dull, relentless throb. I would take the night bus back to Renton, staring out the window at the rain-slicked streets. But the physical labor was only half of the battle. I knew that washing dishes would keep us alive, but it would never set us free. I needed to reclaim my mind. I needed to rebuild my arsenal. I enrolled in night classes at the local community college. It was a desperate, exhausting schedule. I would wake up at 5 in the morning, make Julian a bowl of cheap oatmeal, and walk him to the local public school. Then, I would take the bus to the diner and stand in the boiling steam until 4 in the afternoon. After work, I would rush to pick up Julian from the after-school program. We would go back to the damp basement. I would make him dinner, usually rice and beans, and then I would open my textbooks. I was studying advanced corporate accounting. The books were heavy, expensive, and incredibly dense. I bought them used, their pages highlighted and dog-eared by previous students. The community college was a lifeline. It was a gritty, underfunded institution, but it was a place where I could sharpen my latent financial genius. I sat in the back of the classroom, my hands wrapped in bandages, listening to the lectures with absolute focus. Julian was my silent shadow through all of this. He was a ghost in the basement. He never asked for toys. He never asked for new clothes. He understood the fragile ecosystem of our survival. While I studied, he would sit across from me at the small, wobbly card table we used as a desk. He had discovered the local public library. It became his sanctuary. He would bring home stacks of books. Not children's books. He brought home books on mathematics, logic puzzles, and early computer programming. He would sit under the harsh glare of a cheap LED lamp, completely absorbed in the pages. Sometimes, I would look up from my accounting ledgers and watch him. His small face was always serious. His eyes moved rapidly across the complex diagrams. He was absorbing information at a terrifying rate. He was channeling the trauma of his father's rejection into an absolute academic obsession. He was building his own armor. The months dragged on. The Seattle winter set in, bringing a bone-chilling cold that seeped through the concrete walls of the basement. The dripping pipe in the corner seemed to freeze, only to thaw and drip louder the next day. We were surviving, but we were walking on a razor's edge. One missed paycheck, one medical emergency, and we would fall into the abyss. The pressure was suffocating. I was running on 3 hours of sleep a night. The skin on my hands was permanently scarred from the boiling water. My eyes burned from staring at tiny numbers on spreadsheet printouts. It happened on a Tuesday night in late November. The wind was howling outside, rattling the iron bars on our tiny window. The basement was freezing. I was wrapped in 2 sweaters, sitting at the wobbly card table. I was exhausted. A deep, sickening fatigue had settled into my bones. I was running a low-grade fever, my forehead slick with cold sweat. I was working on a massive, complex accounting assignment for my final project. It was a simulated corporate restructuring ledger. It involved hundreds of moving parts, depreciating assets, tax loopholes, and liability shifts. It was exactly the kind of financial architecture that Vance used to destroy his rivals. I needed to master it. I needed to understand the weapons of the enemy. But my brain was failing me. The numbers were blurring together. The columns of the ledger seemed to shift and dance on the page. I had been staring at the same balance sheet for 3 hours. The accounts were not reconciling. There was a massive discrepancy. A phantom loss of capital that I could not track down. I rubbed my burning eyes. I pressed the heels of my hands against my temples, trying to force the headache away. I felt a wave of absolute despair wash over me. I thought about the $20 million. I thought about the warm, sterile boardroom. I thought about the sheer impossibility of what I was trying to do. I was a dishwasher trying to outsmart Wall Street. It was a joke. I let out a long, shaky breath. I dropped my pencil. It rolled across the table and fell to the concrete floor. I closed my eyes, ready to surrender to the exhaustion. Then, I felt a small, warm presence beside me. I opened my eyes. Julian was standing next to my chair. He was wearing his oversized pajamas, his hair messy from sleep. He had silently climbed out of his air mattress. He did not say a word. He just stood there, looking down at the massive, tangled spreadsheet spread across the table. I tried to smile. I said, "Go back to sleep, Julian. It is late. Mommy is just having a hard time with her homework." He did not move. His eyes were locked on the columns of numbers. His gaze was intense, calculating. He reached out with his small, 8-year-old hand. He picked up the pencil from the floor. He leaned over the table. He pointed the graphite tip at a specific cell buried deep in the 3rd page of the ledger. It was a complex derivative liability calculation. Julian tapped the paper. His voice was quiet, but absolutely certain. He said, "You carried the negative integer across the wrong fiscal quarter. The depreciation is compounding in the wrong column." I froze. My heart stopped beating. I stared at the spot he was pointing to. I traced the line of numbers back to the origin. I ran the calculation in my head. He was right. It was a microscopic error. A tiny transposition of a negative sign that had cascaded through the entire financial model, throwing the entire balance sheet into chaos. It was an error that a seasoned corporate auditor might take weeks to find. Julian had spotted it in less than 30 seconds. I slowly turned my head to look at my son. He was still holding the pencil. His face was completely calm. He was not showing off. He was simply stating a mathematical fact. I realized, in that exact moment, that I was not looking at a normal 8-year-old boy. I was looking at a latent, terrifying genius. He had been sitting in this damp basement, reading library books under a cheap LED lamp, and he had quietly taught himself the language of the universe. He set the pencil down on the table. He looked at me, his eyes reflecting the harsh light of the lamp. He said, "The math is easy, Mom. You just have to put the numbers where they belong." He turned around and walked back to his air mattress. He pulled the thin blanket over his shoulders and closed his eyes. I sat alone at the table. The fever in my blood seemed to vanish, replaced by a sudden, electric surge of adrenaline. I looked down at the corrected ledger. The numbers aligned perfectly. The balance sheet was flawless. I looked over at my sleeping son. The dripping pipe in the corner no longer sounded like a metronome of poverty. It sounded like a countdown. Vance thought he had buried us in the dirt. He thought he had discarded a useless liability. But he was wrong. He had not buried us. He had planted us. I picked up the pencil. I gripped it tightly, ignoring the sharp pain in my cracked, bleeding knuckles. I turned to the next page of the ledger, my mind suddenly crystal clear. The morning light crept through the iron bars of the basement window, painting pale gray stripes across the concrete floor. I did not sleep that night. I sat at the wobbly card table until the sun came up, staring at the corrected ledger. Julian had gone back to sleep, his breathing soft and even in the damp, freezing air. He had casually dismantled a financial puzzle that had paralyzed me for hours. He was 8 years old. I realized then that the universe had not stripped me of my assets. It had simply hidden them. Vance had kept the $20 million, the Hamptons mansion, and the sterile, climate-controlled boardrooms. But I had kept the only asset that actually mattered. I had kept the future. The grueling middle years began the very next day. I did not quit my job at the diner immediately. I could not afford to. I still needed the meager cash to keep the lights on and the dripping pipe from freezing solid. But my mindset had fundamentally shifted. I was no longer a victim hiding in the dark. I was a soldier preparing for a long, silent war. I threw myself into my night classes at the community college with a terrifying intensity. I stopped sleeping more than 4 hours a night. I drank cheap, bitter coffee from a thermos and sat in the back row of the lecture hall, my hands wrapped in white bandages to hide the bleeding cracks from the dishwater. I absorbed every lecture on corporate taxation, liability restructuring, and asset management. I was not just studying to pass a test. I was studying the exact weapons that the men in tailored gray suits used to control the world. My final project for the advanced accounting seminar was a massive, comprehensive corporate audit. I chose a hypothetical real estate conglomerate. I built a financial model that systematically dismantled the company, exposed its hidden tax liabilities, and reallocated its capital to hostile shareholders. It was a predatory, ruthless piece of financial architecture. It was exactly what Vance would have done. I handed the thick stack of paper to Professor Thorne. He was an older man, perceptive and deeply tired, with a tweed jacket that smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and old books. He was the kind of teacher who had seen thousands of desperate students pass through his underfunded classroom. He usually graded papers with a quick, dismissive red pen. A week later, he asked me to stay after the lecture. The classroom emptied out, leaving only the hum of the flickering fluorescent lights. Professor Thorne sat at his desk. He had my project in front of him. There was no red ink on the pages. He looked up at me. His eyes were sharp, piercing right through my exhausted facade. He said, "Evelyn, I have been teaching corporate finance for 30 years. This model is not just mathematically flawless. It is dangerous. It is the work of a seasoned corporate raider. Where did you learn to dismantle a financial entity with such absolute cruelty?" I stood there in my cheap, thrift store sweater. I looked at my scarred hands. I looked back at him. I said, "I learned it from the man who dismantled me." Professor Thorne did not ask any more questions. He understood that some brilliance is forged in the fires of absolute trauma. He opened his desk drawer and pulled out a business card. He slid it across the desk. He said, "I have a former student who is now the chief financial officer at a mid-sized logistics firm in downtown Seattle. They are looking for a junior accountant. The pay is entry-level, but it is a foot in the door. I called him this morning. He is expecting your resume." I took the card. My fingers trembled slightly. It was a small piece of heavy cardstock, but it felt like the key to a prison cell. The interview was 3 days later. I bought a gray suit from a discount rack. It did not fit perfectly. And the fabric was cheap. But I ironed it until the creases were sharp enough to cut glass. I took the bus into the gleaming, tech-booming heart of Seattle. The contrast between the towering glass skyscrapers and my moldy basement in Renton was dizzying. The logistics firm was called Apex Freight. The office was a chaotic, male-dominated environment of ringing phones, shouting dispatchers, and the constant smell of stale coffee and ozone from the copy machines. The HR manager looked at my resume. He frowned at the 10-year gap in my employment history. He leaned back in his chair and said, "Evelyn, you have a solid academic record from a decade ago, and Professor Thorne speaks highly of you. But you have been out of the workforce for a very long time. The corporate landscape moves fast. How do you explain this massive gap?" I did not flinch. I did not apologize. I looked him dead in the eye, channeling the cold, untouchable aura of the Manhattan boardrooms I used to inhabit. I said, "For the past 10 years, I have been engaged in private, high-net-worth asset management. I oversaw a portfolio valued in excess of $20 million. The position required absolute discretion, which is why there are no corporate references. I am now returning to the public sector to seek a more structured operational challenge." It was not a lie. I had managed Vance's household, his charity galas, and his social capital. I had managed his life. The HR manager blinked. He was intimidated by the sheer confidence in my voice. He did not push further. I got the job. The next morning, I walked into the diner for the last time. The kitchen was already a suffocating cloud of steam and grease. The manager yelled at me to get into the dish pit. I walked over to the massive stainless steel sink. The boiling water was churning. I took off my heavy rubber apron. I folded it neatly and placed it on the counter. I looked at the manager. I said, "I am resigning. Effective immediately." He laughed. He said, "You walk out that door, Evelyn, and you are never coming back. You need this job. You have nothing." I looked at the dirty plates. I looked at my cracked, bleeding knuckles. I felt a profound, overwhelming sense of peace. I said, "You are wrong. I have everything I need." I walked out the back door of the kitchen. The cold Seattle rain hit my face. It felt like a baptism. I was free from the boiling water. I was stepping onto the corporate battlefield. Apex Freight was a brutal ecosystem. It was filled with arrogant young executives who wore expensive cologne and thought they were apex predators. They spoke in crisp corporate jargon, throwing around terms like synergy, bandwidth, and paradigm shifts. They treated the junior accounting staff like invisible drones. They reminded me of ants. But they were lesser versions. They were sloppy. They were driven by ego, not by cold, calculating logic. I spent my first year in absolute silence. I sat in my small gray cubicle, staring at spreadsheets, processing expense reports, and reconciling the daily freight ledgers. I was the invisible woman in the cheap suit. They ignored me. And that was their fatal mistake. Because while they were ignoring me, I was observing everything. I noticed the bloated expense accounts of the regional managers. I noticed the massive inefficiencies in the fuel routing models. I noticed that the vice president of operations, a smug man named Marcus, was hiding catastrophic losses in the quarterly projections by shifting depreciating assets into offshore holding accounts. It was exactly the kind of financial shell game I had studied in the basement. I did not expose Marcus immediately. I waited. I built my case. I created shadow ledgers on my encrypted hard drive, tracking every single stolen dollar, every manipulated metric, and every operational failure. I was gathering ammunition. My trauma had forged a terrifying resilience inside me. When you have survived the psychological torture of a $20 million betrayal, a passive-aggressive email from a middle manager means absolutely nothing. When you have scrubbed baked grease from iron skillets until your hands bled, the pressure of a corporate deadline is a joke. I was immune to their office politics. I was a machine. My opportunity came during a massive end-of-year financial audit. The external auditors found a discrepancy in Marcus's department. Panic swept through the executive floor. Marcus tried to blame the junior accounting staff. He tried to blame me. He called me into his office. He stood behind his mahogany desk, trying to use his physical presence to intimidate me. He said, "Evelyn, your department failed to reconcile the fuel surcharges. You are going to take the fall for this, or I will make sure you are blacklisted from every financial firm in Seattle." I looked at his mahogany desk. It was a cheap imitation of the one in New York. I felt my pulse slow down. The ice entered my veins. I reached into my folder. I pulled out a 20-page report, printed on heavy stock paper. I placed it gently on his desk. I said, "Marcus, this is a comprehensive audit of your operational budget over the last 14 months. It details exactly how you have been artificially inflating the fuel surcharges to cover the losses in your private vendor contracts. It includes the routing numbers for the offshore accounts. I have already sent a secure, encrypted copy to the chief financial officer and the board of directors." All the color drained from his face. He stared at the report as if it were a live explosive. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. I leaned forward, resting my hands on his desk. My scars were fully visible. I said, "You thought I was a liability. You thought I was invisible. But I have been watching you since the day I arrived. Pack your office, Marcus. You are done." I walked out of his office without looking back. By the end of the week, Marcus was fired. The chief financial officer called me into his office. He was terrified of me, but he respected the absolute ruthlessness of my audit. He promoted me to senior financial analyst. He doubled my salary. That weekend, Julian and I moved out of the Renton basement. We packed our few belongings into garbage bags. I took the deflated air mattress and threw it into the dumpster behind the crumbling house. I stood in the damp concrete box one last time. I listened to the dripping pipe. Drip. 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 It had been the soundtrack of our survival. Now, it was just an echo of the past. Our new apartment was in a modest building closer to the city center. It was on the 4th floor. It had hardwood floors, a clean kitchen, and a real bed for Julian. But the most important feature was the window in the living room. It was large, facing west toward the Puget Sound. The first morning we woke up in the new apartment, the Seattle clouds broke. A brilliant, blinding ray of sunlight pierced through the glass and illuminated the hardwood floor. It was warm. It was clean. Julian walked into the living room. He was 12 years old now. He had grown taller, his shoulders broadening, but he still possessed that intense, quiet stillness. He stood in the patch of sunlight. He closed his eyes and just let the warmth wash over his face. I stood in the doorway, watching him. The psychological weight that had been crushing my chest for 4 years finally began to lift. We were no longer buried. We had broken through the soil. As I ascended the corporate ladder, Julian was accelerating at a frightening pace. He was a phantom in the local high school. He did not care about sports, social cliques, or teenage rebellion. His mind was operating on a completely different frequency. With my first bonus check, I bought him a refurbished laptop. It was a heavy, blocky machine, but to Julian, it was a portal to the infinite. He took it apart on the kitchen table, upgraded the memory board, and reassembled it in under an hour. He began to dive deep into the architecture of the digital world. He taught himself Python. He mastered C++. He read complex manuals on algorithmic data structures the way other boys read comic books. When he was 14, his high school math teacher practically begged him to enter the state mathematics Olympiad. Julian agreed, mostly because he was bored. The competition was held in a massive, echoing gymnasium filled with the smell of floor polish and nervous sweat. Hundreds of the brightest students in the state were hunched over their desks, agonizing over the complex equations. Julian finished the 3-hour exam in 47 minutes. He handed his paper to the proctor, walked out of the gymnasium, and sat on a bench outside, reading a book on artificial intelligence until the competition was over. He won first place by a massive margin. When they handed him the cheap plastic trophy, he did not smile. He did not brag. He just walked over to me, handed me the trophy, and said, "Can we go home now, Mom? I need to finish compiling a code sequence." He was not playing games on that laptop. He was building an empire of his own. By the time he was 15, Julian had noticed a massive inefficiency in the way small shipping companies handled their logistics data. He had listened to me talk about the supply chain nightmares at Apex Freight. He absorbed the corporate jargon, the pain points, and the financial bottlenecks. Working entirely in his bedroom, often late into the night under the blue glow of his monitor, Julian built a software-as-a-service application. It was a brilliant, lightweight data optimization tool. It used a proprietary algorithm to help small freight companies consolidate their shipping routes, saving them thousands of dollars in fuel and labor costs. He called the application Node Stream. He launched it quietly on a few niche industry forums. He operated under a pseudonym, calling himself Architect. He answered customer support tickets, patched bugs, and rolled out updates while eating his cereal before school. He was a boy king ruling a digital realm, and nobody in the real world had any idea. Meanwhile, the real world was crashing down around Apex Freight. I was 38 years old. I had spent the last few years solidifying my reputation as the most ruthless, efficient financial analyst in the company. But the global economy was shifting. Fuel prices skyrocketed. 2 of our largest international clients defaulted on their contracts. The company hit a massive liquidity crisis. The board of directors panicked. The chief executive officer called an emergency all-hands meeting. The atmosphere in the room was suffocating. The executives looked pale and terrified. The CEO stood at the front of the room and announced that to avoid bankruptcy, the company would be implementing a 30% workforce reduction. Mass layoffs. Hundreds of people were going to lose their jobs. I sat in the back of the room. I looked at the terrified faces of the warehouse managers, the dispatchers, and the junior accountants. I remembered the feeling of the freezing wind on the streets of New York. I remembered the absolute terror of having nothing. I knew that laying off the workforce would destroy the company's operational capacity. It was a panic move. It was weak. I did not sleep for the next 3 days. I locked myself in my office. I pulled every single financial ledger, every debt covenant, every vendor contract, and every operational metric the company possessed. I drank black coffee until my hands shook. I built a comprehensive, radical financial restructuring plan. It was a masterpiece of corporate survival. It involved renegotiating the amortized debt with the primary lenders, liquidating 3 underperforming real estate assets, and implementing a brutal, streamlined operational matrix that eliminated executive bonuses and slashed administrative waste. On Thursday morning, I bypassed my manager. I bypassed the chief financial officer. I walked directly into the executive boardroom, where the board of directors was holding an emergency session. The room was a sterile, windowless vault. There was a massive mahogany table in the center. A heavy clock ticked on the wall. It was an exact replica of the room where Vance had destroyed my life. The PTSD hit me like a physical blow. My chest tightened. The air felt freezing. For a split second, I expected to see Vance sitting at the head of the table, smirking at me. I expected to see the lawyer sliding a contract across the wood. I closed my eyes. I took a slow, deep breath. I felt the faint, raised scars on my knuckles. The memory of the boiling dishwater grounded me. I opened my eyes. The ghosts vanished. I was not the victim anymore. I was the architect. I walked to the head of the table. The board members stared at me in absolute shock. The CEO demanded to know what I was doing. I did not ask for permission. I plugged my laptop into the projector. The screen illuminated with my restructuring model. I spoke with an icy, unshakable authority. I said, "Gentlemen, your plan to lay off 30% of the workforce is a catastrophic error. It will trigger a death spiral of operational failure. You are panicking." I do not panic. I have built a model that will save this company, preserve the workforce, and satisfy the debt covenants. Sit down and look at the numbers. For the next 2 hours, I commanded the room. I dismantled their objections with clinical precision. I showed them exactly where the capital was hiding. I showed them how to bleed the excess without cutting the muscle. I spoke their language flawlessly, using their crisp corporate jargon as a weapon. When I finished, the room was dead silent. The ticking clock sounded incredibly loud. The chairman of the board, an intimidating man who rarely spoke, leaned forward. He looked at the projected numbers. He looked at me. He said, "Implement it." Every single phase. The layoffs were cancelled. The company stabilized. The restructuring was a massive, undeniable triumph. The next week, I was promoted to Regional Director of Finance. I was given a corner office with a door, a massive salary, and a seat at the executive table. I had clawed my way from the damp concrete of a Renton basement to the absolute peak of the corporate mountain. But my victory was only the beginning. A few months later, on a rainy Tuesday evening, I came home from my executive office. I took off my tailored coat and walked into the kitchen. Julian was 16 years old. He was sitting at the kitchen table. His laptop was open. He was staring at the screen with a strange, unreadable expression. I poured a glass of water. I asked him, "What is wrong, Julian? Is there a bug in the code?" He looked up at me. His eyes were wide. He said, "Mom, I need you to look at this." I walked over and looked over his shoulder. It was an email thread. An Austin-based tech firm, backed by a massive Silicon Valley venture capital group, had discovered Node Stream. They had realized that the algorithm powering the application was light years ahead of anything on the market. They wanted to acquire the software. They had sent an initial buyout offer of $50,000 to the mysterious architect. I read the thread. Julian had not panicked. He had not accepted the first offer. Operating entirely through email, this 16-year-old boy had negotiated with a team of seasoned corporate lawyers. He had countered their arguments, highlighted the proprietary nature of his data structures, and leveraged their desperation. He had negotiated like a ruthless corporate raider. I scrolled to the final email in the chain. It was a signed term sheet. The Austin firm had agreed to his final counteroffer. They were buying NodeStream for $250,000, plus a retained 5% equity stake in the newly formed subsidiary. I stopped breathing. I stared at the number on the screen. $250,000. Julian reached into his backpack. He pulled out a heavy, overnight courier envelope. He opened it and pulled out a piece of paper. It was a certified cashier's check. He placed it on the kitchen table. He slid it across the smooth wood toward me. He looked at me. His voice was quiet, but filled with a fierce, protective love. He said, "This is for you, Mom. So you never have to worry again. So you never have to be afraid of the dark." I looked at the check. It was more money than I had seen in almost a decade. It was safety. It was absolute security. I looked at my son. He had built this empire from a refurbished laptop. He had channeled all his trauma, all his silent observation, into pure creation. I reached out and placed my hand over the check. I slowly slid it back across the table toward him. Julian frowned. He said, "Mom, take it." I shook my head. I said, "No, Julian. This is your capital. This is the foundation of your empire." I sat down across from him. I looked deeply into his eyes. I needed him to understand the fundamental difference between survival and power. I said, "When we lived in that basement, we were surviving. Every dollar was a shield against starvation. But we are not surviving anymore. We are building wealth. Money is just paper. Julian, wealth is leverage. Wealth is the ability to ensure that no one, no man in a tailored suit, no corporate entity, can ever tell you what your life is worth." I tapped the check. I said, "Tomorrow morning, we are going to the bank. We are opening a brokerage account in your name. I am going to teach you about index funds, compound interest, and capital reallocation. You are going to invest every single penny of this. You are going to make this money work for you until it becomes an unstoppable force." Julian looked at the check. Then he looked at me. A slow, understanding smile spread across his face. He nodded. The next 2 years were a period of profound, untouchable peace. We had won. We had beaten the odds. I was a powerful executive. Julian was a wealthy, brilliant young man. The trauma of New York felt like a distant, fading nightmare. It was the spring of Julian's senior year of high school. We were sitting in the living room. The sunlight was pouring through the large window. Julian was checking his email on his phone. Suddenly, he gasped. He dropped his phone onto the couch, he covered his mouth with his hands. I stood up, my heart racing. I asked, Julian, what is it? He looked at me, his eyes shining with unshed tears. He said, Mom. It is an email from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He took a shaky breath. He said, I got in. They offered me a full-ride scholarship. The joy that exploded in my chest was blinding. It was the culmination of every burned hand, every sleepless night, every tear shed in the dark. I ran to him. I pulled him into a massive, crushing hug. We laughed. We cried. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated triumph. Then, the phone rang. It was my personal cell phone, resting on the kitchen counter. The ringtone shattered the joyous silence of the apartment. I walked over to the counter. I looked at the caller identification. It was a New York area code. A cold spike of dread pierced my stomach. I had not received a call from New York in 8 years. I picked up the phone. I pressed it to my ear. I said, hello? The voice on the other end was trembling. It was my aunt. A woman I had not spoken to since the day I threw my SIM card out the window of the yellow cab. She said, Evelyn? Oh. Thank God I found your number. Evelyn. You need to listen to me. Her voice was frantic, filled with a terrifying urgency. She said, I am so sorry. I did not tell him. I swear. But Vance knows. The blood drained from my face. The sunlight in the apartment suddenly felt freezing cold. My aunt continued, her voice dropping to a terrified whisper. She said, he saw an article in a tech journal about the Nord Stream buyout. He recognized Julian's name. Evelyn, his real estate company is bleeding money. His marriage to Sloane is falling apart. He is desperate. He knows about the boy. He knows about the money. And he is furious. I stared blankly at the wall. The dripping pipe from the basement echoed in my memory. My aunt said, Evelyn. He is looking for you. He is coming to Seattle. My aunt continued, her voice dropping to a terrified whisper. She said, he saw an article in a tech journal about the Nord Stream buyout. He recognized Julian's name. Evelyn, his real estate company is bleeding money. His marriage to Sloane is falling apart. He is desperate. He knows about the boy. He knows about the money. And he is furious. I stared blankly at the wall. The dripping pipe from the basement echoed in my memory. My aunt said, Evelyn, he is looking for you. He is coming to Seattle. The ghosts of Manhattan had found us. I did not drop the phone. I did not scream. I did not feel the suffocating, blinding terror that used to paralyze me 10 years ago. I simply pressed the end call button. I set the phone down on the smooth granite countertop of my kitchen. I looked across the living room at Julian. He was still sitting on the couch. The acceptance letter from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology was glowing brightly on his laptop screen. He had heard my side of the conversation. He knew exactly who had called. He knew exactly what it meant. He looked at me. His face was completely calm. He was 18 years old now. He was a millionaire in his own right. He was an architect of the digital world. He asked, is he coming here? I nodded slowly. I said, yes. He is looking for us. Julian turned his attention back to his laptop. He typed a few lines of code. He did not even blink. His heart rate did not elevate. He said, let him come. He has no jurisdiction here. It was the absolute truth. Vance was a predator who relied on leverage. He relied on fear. He relied on the power of his checkbook to force compliance. But we had stripped him of his leverage. We had conquered our fear in the boiling dishwater and the freezing dampness of the Renton basement. We had built our own fortress. Brick by agonizing brick. Vance was not a threat anymore. He was just a ghost. And ghosts cannot hurt you in the daylight. 2 months later, the Seattle summer arrived. The heavy, oppressive gray clouds finally broke. They revealed a brilliant, piercing blue sky that stretched endlessly over the Puget Sound. It was time for Julian to leave. We stood in the bustling departure terminal of the Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. The noise of rolling suitcases, chattering crowds, and overhead announcements echoed around us. It felt like a lifetime ago that we had arrived at this very same airport. Back then, we were refugees. We were carrying nothing but a small backpack and the clothes on our backs. We were running for our lives. Now, Julian stood tall in the center of the terminal. He wore a simple, dark jacket. His posture was perfect. He carried a sleek leather duffel bag. Inside that bag was his laptop, his notebooks, and the complex algorithmic blueprints for his next software venture. He was heading to Boston. He was stepping into the elite, high-pressure corridors of the greatest technological institute in the world. I looked up at my son. The quiet, 8-year-old boy who had silently corrected my accounting ledger in the dark was gone. In his place stood a formidable, brilliant young man. I reached out and adjusted the collar of his jacket. My hands were still scarred. The faint white lines across my knuckles were a permanent map of our survival. I said, "You have everything you need, Julian. You built your own armor. Do not let anyone in that city tell you what your mind is worth." He looked down at me. His eyes held that same ancient, calculating depth he had possessed as a child. But now, there was also a profound, unbreakable warmth. He pulled me into a tight, fierce embrace. He whispered, "I learned from the best, Mom. I will call you the second I land." I stepped back. I watched him walk through the security checkpoint. He did not look back with hesitation. He did not stumble. He walked with the absolute certainty of a king stepping into his kingdom. I drove back to the city alone. I walked into our apartment. It was quiet. It was empty. But it was not lonely. The silence was not the heavy, suffocating silence of the basement. It was the peaceful, golden silence of victory. I was completely alone. But I had never been more powerful. I was now the regional vice president of finance for Apex Freight. My office was on the top floor of a gleaming glass tower in downtown Seattle. I had a massive, floor-to-ceiling window that overlooked the water. The ferries moved slowly across the sound, leaving white wakes in the deep blue water. My desk was not mahogany. It was sleek, modern glass and steel. I did not need heavy, intimidating furniture to prove my worth. My numbers did the talking. My reputation preceded me in every boardroom on the West Coast. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late October. The rain had returned to Seattle. It was lashing against the thick glass of my office window, a constant, rhythmic drumming. I was reviewing a complex merger and acquisition file. I was calculating the depreciation of a rival firm's physical assets. My assistant, a sharp young woman named Sarah, buzzed my intercom. Her voice sounded hesitant. She said, "Evelyn, there is a man here to see you. He does not have an appointment. He bypassed the lobby security." She paused. She said, "He says it is a family emergency. He says his name is Vance Sterling." The name hung in the climate-controlled air of my office. The syllables felt heavy. They felt toxic. I did not panic. My chest did not tighten. I simply closed the acquisition file. I aligned my silver pen perfectly parallel to the edge of my glass desk. I pressed the intercom button. I said, "Send him in, Sarah." The heavy glass door to my office opened. Vance walked in. For a fraction of a second, I did not recognize him. The man who had sat across from me in the sterile Manhattan boardroom 10 years ago was gone. That man had been sharp, immaculate, and terrifying. That man had worn a tailored gray suit like a suit of armor. This man was a crumbling ruin. His suit hung loosely on his frame, as if he had lost 20 pounds in a matter of weeks. The fabric was wrinkled. His hair was thinning, completely gray, and unkempt. The skin around his eyes was deeply lined. It sagged with exhaustion and the unmistakable, suffocating weight of chronic stress. He looked old. He looked incredibly desperate. He stopped in the center of my office. He looked around. He took in the expensive modern art on the walls. He looked at the panoramic view of the city. He absorbed the sheer scale of my corporate authority. Then, he looked at me. I was sitting behind the glass desk, wearing a tailored navy blazer, my hands folded perfectly in front of me. He swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed in his throat. He said, "Evelyn, you look well." I did not stand up. I did not offer him a seat. I looked at him with clinical, icy indifference. I said, "State your business, Vance. I have a board meeting in 15 minutes. He flinched. The coldness in my voice hit him like a physical blow. He was used to women shrinking in his presence. He was used to me shrinking. He was used to commanding the emotional temperature of every room he entered. He took a step forward. He wrung his hands together. It was a pathetic, nervous gesture. It was the gesture of a beggar. He said, "I need to see Julian. I know he is here. I know about the tech buyout. I read the article in the Financial Journal." His voice began to rise, tinged with a frantic edge. He said, "He is my son, Evelyn. I have a right to see him." I stared at him. The sheer audacity of his delusion was almost fascinating. It was a masterclass in narcissistic collapse. I said, "You surrendered your rights to Julian 10 years ago. You signed a contract. You priced him at $0. You looked at an 8-year-old boy and called him a liability." Vance shook his head frantically. He took another step toward my desk. He said, "I made a mistake. I was under a massive amount of pressure back then. The commercial real estate market was volatile." He pointed a shaking finger in the air. He said, "Sloan was in my ear. She poisoned me against you. She poisoned me against my own boy. It was her fault." I did not blink. I let him ramble. I let him expose the absolute hollow core of his character. He placed his hands on the edge of my glass desk. He leaned forward. I could smell the stale coffee and sour sweat on his breath. He said, "Sloan left me, Evelyn. She took half of the liquid assets and filed for a brutal divorce. The commercial sector collapsed. My company is bleeding capital. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and pleading. He said, the banks are calling in the mezzanine loans. I am drowning. I am going to lose the Sterling building. He swallowed again. He said, Julian has capital now. He has connections in the tech sector. If he could just co-sign a bridge loan, or introduce me to his venture capital board, I could save the empire. We are family, Evelyn. We have to help each other. I sat perfectly still. I let the silence stretch out. I let it fill the room. I let it suffocate him. I looked at his hands resting on my desk. They were manicured, soft, and trembling. They had never scrubbed a burned iron skillet. They had never bled for survival. I looked down at my own hands. I saw the faint, white scars. I saw the physical price I had paid to survive his cruelty. I looked back up into his desperate eyes. I said, the Sterling Empire is dead, Vance. And you killed it. He opened his mouth to argue. He tried to speak. I raised a single finger. The gesture was so absolute, so commanding, that he instantly snapped his mouth shut. I said, Julian is not here. He is in Boston. He is attending the Massachusetts Institute of Technology on a full academic scholarship. I leaned forward slightly. I dropped my voice to a lethal, quiet register. I said, he is a millionaire. He is a genius. And he does not think about you at all. Vance stared at me. All the remaining color drained from his face. He looked like a man who had just been diagnosed with a terminal illness. I continued. I said, you do not get to claim the harvest when you refuse to water the soil. You buried us in the dirt. You left us to freeze. You do not get to walk into my office and ask for a lifeline. I reached out and pressed the button on my intercom. I said, Sarah, please call building security. Have Mr. Sterling escorted off the premises immediately. If he returns, have him arrested for criminal trespass. Vance stumbled backward. He pulled his hands off my desk as if the glass had burned him. He whispered, Evelyn, please. You cannot do this. I have nothing. I looked at him. I searched my soul for a shred of pity. I found absolutely nothing. Just the cold, perfect balance of a reconciled ledger. I said, I know exactly what it feels like to have nothing. Now, it is your turn to learn. 2 large security guards in dark suits entered my office. They flanked Vance. They took him by the arms. He did not fight them. He did not shout. He just hung his head. His shoulders slumped in total, irreversible defeat. They led him out the glass door. The door clicked shut behind him. I sat alone in my office. The rain continued to beat against the window. I picked up my silver pen. I reopened the merger acquisition file. My hand was perfectly steady. That evening, I called Julian. He answered on the second ring. I could hear the faint, echoing sound of a lecture hall in the background. I said, Julian, your father came to my office today. He asked for money. He asked for you. There was a brief pause on the line. Then, Julian laughed. It was not a bitter laugh. It was not an angry, resentful laugh. It was a light, genuine chuckle. It was the sound of a young man who was completely, utterly untouchable. He said, did you tell him my consulting fee is $5,000 an hour? I smiled. I looked out at the glittering lights of the Seattle skyline. I said, I told him he was trespassing. Security escorted him out. Julian said. Good. I have to go, Mom. I am compiling a new neural network model for my advanced robotics class. I will call you on Sunday. He hung up. He had dismissed Vance Sterling from his mind in less than 30 seconds. The ghost had been permanently exorcised. 3 years passed. I was 41 years old. I had been promoted to the chief financial officer of Apex Freight. I had guided the company through a massive, highly profitable international expansion. I was recognized as one of the most brilliant, ruthless financial strategists on the West Coast. In early November, I received a heavy, cream-colored envelope in the mail. It was sealed with dark red wax. It was an invitation from the Global Financial Architecture Summit. It was the most prestigious corporate finance conference in the country. It was held annually in Manhattan. They were inviting me to deliver the keynote address. I booked a first-class ticket to John F. Kennedy International Airport. The flight was a profound, surreal echo of my past. 13 years ago, I had sat in the very last row of economy. I had clutched a terrified 8-year-old boy. I had stared at the back of a seat, calculating the terrifying math of our survival. Now, I sat in a wide, heated leather seat. I sipped sparkling water from a glass. I reviewed my speech on a sleek digital tablet. I was flying back to the city that had tried to destroy me. I landed in New York. A black town car was waiting for me at the curb. The driver opened the door, and I slid into the quiet, luxurious interior. We drove through the streets of Manhattan. The city looked exactly the same. The towering glass skyscrapers pierced the gray sky. The chaotic traffic blared. The freezing wind whipped between the concrete canyons, but I was different. I was no longer prey. I was the apex predator. The summit was held in the grand ballroom of a massive, historic hotel on the Upper East Side. The room was a cavern of gold leaf, crystal chandeliers, and deep red velvet. It was filled with thousands of the most powerful executives, venture capitalists, and real estate moguls in the world. They wore tailored gray suits. They smelled of expensive cologne and ruthless ambition. I stood backstage. I listened to the master of ceremonies read my biography over the massive sound system. He spoke of my innovative restructuring models. He spoke of my leadership at Apex Freight. He spoke of my reputation for absolute, surgical financial precision. Then, he called my name. I walked out onto the massive stage. The spotlight hit me. The applause was a deafening roar. I wore a perfectly tailored, charcoal gray suit. I walked to the clear acrylic podium. I placed my hands on the edges. I looked out over the sea of faces. And then, I saw him. He was sitting in the 12th row. Vance. He looked even worse than he had in my Seattle office. He was wearing a suit that was clearly 5 years out of date. The lapels were frayed. His face was gaunt, his cheekbones jutting out sharply against his pale skin. He was sitting on the edge of his seat. He was staring up at me with an expression of absolute, crushing realization. He was watching the woman he had thrown away command the room. He was watching the liability he had discarded become the most valuable asset in the building. I did not break eye contact with him. I leaned into the microphone. I delivered my keynote address. I spoke about the architecture of resilience. I spoke about identifying hidden value in depreciating assets. I spoke about the fatal flaw of corporate arrogance. I detailed the catastrophic danger of treating human capital as disposable. I explained how empires crumble when they value short-term greed over long-term loyalty. Every word was a perfectly aimed strike. I was dismantling his entire worldview in front of 3,000 of his peers. I was exposing his failure without ever saying his name. When I finished, the room erupted into a standing ovation. I nodded once. I turned, and I walked off the stage. I had conquered Manhattan. An hour later, I was sitting in the private, dimly lit lounge of the hotel. I was drinking a glass of deep red wine. I was reviewing some emails on my phone. A shadow fell over my small, round table. I looked up. Vance was standing there. He looked like a hollow shell of a human being. His hands were shaking violently at his sides. He whispered, "Evelyn. Please. Just 5 minutes." I gestured to the empty leather chair across from me. I said, "Sit down, Vance. Before you fall down." He collapsed into the chair. He looked at the crystal glass of wine in my hand. He looked at the heavy, expensive watch on my wrist. He said, "Your speech. It was brilliant. You were brilliant." I took a slow sip of my wine. I tasted the dark cherry and oak. I said, "I was always brilliant, Vance. You just preferred me to be quiet." He squeezed his eyes shut. A single tear escaped. It rolled down his weathered, sunken cheek. He said, "I lost everything. The bankruptcy was finalized last month. The bank took the Hamptons house. They took the Sterling building." He opened his eyes. They were completely dead. He said, "I am living in a rented, one-bedroom apartment in Queens. I have nothing left." He leaned forward. His voice cracked with raw, pathetic agony. He said, "I was wrong, Evelyn. I was so incredibly wrong. I traded my family for a balance sheet, and the math did not work out. I am so sorry." I looked at him. I searched the deepest corners of my soul for a shred of sympathy. I searched for the burning anger that used to keep me awake in the basement. I found nothing. Just a quiet, profound emptiness where he used to be. I set my wine glass down on the table. I said, "Apologies are just words, Vance. They do not change the ledger. They do not unburn my hands. They do not erase the terror in my son's eyes when you put a price tag on his head." I leaned forward. I looked directly into his broken eyes. I said, "You made a transaction 13 years ago. You bought your freedom for $20 million. You got exactly what you paid for. The transaction is closed. There are no refunds." I stood up. I picked up my phone. I smoothed the front of my jacket. Vance reached out a trembling hand. He whispered, "Evelyn, what am I supposed to do now?" I looked down at him. I delivered my final verdict. I said, "You are going to live the rest of your life knowing that the empire you chose over us turned to ashes. And you are going to watch from the shadows as my son builds a new world without you." I turned and walked out of the lounge. I did not look back. I left him sitting alone in the dark, surrounded by the ghosts of his own making. 5 more years passed. I was 46 years old. I had officially retired from my position as chief financial officer. I had amassed enough wealth to ensure that my bloodline would never know the cold dampness of a basement ever again. I spent my days living a life of profound peace and purpose. I sat on the boards of 3 major charitable foundations. I focused my energy and capital on providing financial literacy and emergency housing for women escaping domestic abuse. Julian was 26. He had graduated from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology with dual doctorates. He was living in Silicon Valley. He was running a massive, highly successful artificial intelligence firm. He was brilliant. He was kind. He was fiercely loyal. We spoke on the phone every single Sunday. It was a quiet Thursday morning in Seattle. The rain was falling softly against the massive windows of my penthouse apartment. I was sitting on a plush velvet sofa. I was drinking a cup of hot chamomile tea. I was reading a novel. My phone rang. It was a number I did not recognize. It was a New York area code. I set my teacup down on the saucer. I answered the call. I said, "Hello?" A formal, clinical voice spoke on the other end. It was a lawyer. But it was not the ruthless, expensive lawyer from the boardroom. It was a public estate executor. He said, "Am I speaking with Evelyn Sterling?" I said, "My name is Evelyn. I dropped the Sterling name 18 years ago." The lawyer cleared his throat. He sounded tired. He said, "I apologize, ma'am. I am calling to inform you that Vance Sterling passed away late last night." The words hung in the quiet, warm air of my apartment. I asked, "How?" The lawyer said, "He suffered a massive heart attack. He was alone in a small office he was renting in Queens. He was found by the building manager this morning." The lawyer paused. I could hear the rustling of cheap paper over the line. He said, "Ma'am, as the executor of his final affairs, I must inform you that his estate is entirely insolvent. There are no assets. There is only massive, unrecoverable debt. He left nothing behind." I looked out the window at the gray Seattle sky. I said, "I know. He has had nothing for a very long time." The lawyer asked, "Will you or your son be claiming the remains for a memorial service?" I took a slow, deep breath. I thought about the sterile, freezing boardroom. I thought about the $20 million. I thought about the dripping pipe in the Renton basement. I thought about the boiling dishwater and the bleeding cracks on my knuckles. I said, "No. We have no claim to him. Let the city handle it." I hung up the phone. I stood up from the velvet sofa. I walked over to the massive, floor-to-ceiling window. I looked out over the Seattle skyline. The city was a sprawling matrix of glass, steel, and deep green pine trees. It was shrouded in the beautiful, perpetual mist of the Pacific Northwest. I placed my hand against the cool glass. My knuckles were still scarred. They would always be scarred. They were the permanent, undeniable receipts of my survival. I felt a profound, majestic silence settle over my soul. The universe is a massive, complex ledger. Every action has a reaction. Every debt must eventually be paid. Vance had treated life like a balance sheet. He believed that human beings were depreciating assets. He chose his empire of mahogany tables and tailored suits. He chose absolute greed. And in the end, his empire crumbled to dust. He died alone in a rented room, crushed by the weight of his own absolute zero. I had chosen the freezing wind. I had chosen the boiling dishwater. I had chosen the terrifying, beautiful burden of a mother's love. I chose my son. And it saved me. The scales of the universe were finally, perfectly balanced.